So welcome once again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. I'm going to attempt to do this in a slightly different way. One of the things that I'm doing is not recording this in a way where you'll be able to see my screen or see what I'm reading from. And part of that is because I actually actively want to encourage you to go and find some of these things for yourself and go and look at this information. Now, I'll do my best to make sure that I tell you exactly what I'm reading from so that you have somewhere to go and find it or some strong indication. But there's a degree to which feeding absolutely everything may not have the intended outcome. And some of the intended outcome is to have anybody who consumes the material that I present to try to figure some of it out on their own as well, not simply give absolutely everything. So the thing that I'm going to try to balance here is a paper that is currently in print from the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. Now, it is more of a maybe it's either an opinion piece or it is something like a narrative review. I don't even know that it's a narrative review because I can't see the whole paper, unfortunately. But primarily, it's going to give some information on how osteopathic claims have been made across time. Now, if you go and look back at much of the stuff that I've done, you will note that I have definitely talked about that. So if you look at the Osteopathic History Project that you can find on my YouTube channel, which is the Osteopathic Lyceum, which you may be consuming this on at the moment, you'll see that I've spoken to much of this more from the philosophy of science side and maybe less from the angle that they're coming from. So they've given the concept a name. So the paper, the name of the paper is It's All Connected, So It All Matters: The Fallacy of Osteopathic Anatomical Possibilism. The primary author is Diego F. Hidalgo. Secondary and tertiary, or just contributing authors, would be Andrew McMillan and Oliver P. Thompson. This was published February 15th, 2024 in the International Journal of Osteopathic Medicine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the abstract, and then as I do that, I'll tell you that I am reading, that I've pulled out of reading, that I'm adding essentially color commentary and things of that nature. So we'll definitely work through this. So the abstract, to begin reading. Anatomy has been a cornerstone of osteopathic theory, practice, and identity since the discipline's emergence in the 1800s and continues to be viewed as core knowledge to the present day. The domain of anatomical knowledge has provided seemingly endless rationales and explanations to justify osteopathic diagnosis, assessment, and treatment. Moreover, knowledge of anatomy has been foundational for osteopaths' professional identity and conception of healthcare practice. Anatomical possibilism refers to the imagined, exaggerated, implausible, and unproven relationships which are claimed to exist between anatomical structures. In persisting with such an approach to theory, practice, and reasoning, osteopathy may waste time, energy, and intellectual capital, and as a result fail to take advantage of opportunities to develop more plausible, ethical, and person-focused approaches to patient care. So the term that these authors have generated, anatomical possibilism, totally on board with as a category description of what many people have done throughout the history of the profession. So to try to explain this in a way that sits well with me, and maybe sits well with others, is to use the philosophy of science. So you have ontology, which is a theory of reality, or the study of reality. You have general ends of the spectrum within philosophy, which is the one end is constructivism. So the truth is completely dependent on the individual environment of observation and previous experience of the individual. Then you have the other end where there is, so that means there are many realities that are dependent. Then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is positivism, which was essentially puts forward that there is a singular reality that can be identified by appropriate experimentation or observation, and the challenge is always the observer. So you're going to do everything you can to deal with the challenge of the observer. On top of ontology, you then have epistemology. Epistemology requires a view of reality because epistemology is the theory of knowledge or the theory of truth, or the study of knowledge or the study of truth. So on one end, you have constructivism. Constructivism posits or puts forward that the truth or reality or what can be known is completely dependent on the individual, the previous experience of the individual, and the environment of observation. And positivism is the other end of that spectrum that says there is a singular reality that is entirely dependent on the or there is a singular reality that can be appropriately identified with appropriate observation or experimentation. Now, I use the same definition for ontology and epistemology on either end of the spectrum. Maybe it's more reasonable to say that with respect to ontology in philosophy, you have those who believe that ideas are the most real things, and then you have those that believe that material objects are the most real things. Now, that is in the philosophical realm. In the realm of science, ontology really more so refers to how you are categorizing reality so that you can observe it and compare things. So you describe each thing in their own right, and then you compare them, right? So ontology probably better refers in science to the categories that you're using to observe. Now, they can be called qualitative, they can be called quantitative. Either way, you're going to have a set of boundaries in which you are going to describe something, and then you're going to have another set of boundaries and another set of boundaries, and those would be called categories. The or the a category would be supported or underpinned by a construct, and a construct is essentially something that is identifiably itself and not other things. So each category would essentially refer to a construct upon which you can describe something. So there's a little bit that may be somewhat abstract. To try to make that more concrete, if you were to talk about a construct, right? So simply, very simply, you could talk about length. There are different ways to measure length, and you can normalize between those different ways, but you could have a length measurement. So one thing could be an inch long, one thing could be 2.25 inches long, right? But you can now compare those things because you have a stable construct upon which to describe things. Now, that happens to be a normalized measurement. You could talk about, say, the light spectrum. Now, if I say light spectrum, you could also alternately say the color of something. So you could say that something is at this many hertz within the wavelength. I believe it's hertz. Or light temperature. Maybe it's temperature is better. I think it's light temperature. So light temperature, you could give the number, the normalized comparative scale, or you could give the perceived color. That perceived color could be blue, red, yellow, whatever it happens to be, but you can then note the similarities or the difference in multiple ways with respect to the light spectrum or the visible light spectrum or the invisible light spectrum, like infrared and things like that. You could talk about mass, right? So you could talk about how much something weighs. You can talk about shape, right? Something may be round, something may be square, or you could say, when describing shape, something has this many pointed edges, right, and straight lines. You could say this thing has this many straight lines and this many curved lines, right? So you could describe it. So you can describe it qualitatively, quantitatively. Either one can normalize to the other one. So an inch is a quality that something presents, but it is also normalized and reported as a quantity, right? So qualitative and quantitative are not that much different. Now, that's a lot of rambling to try to couch what I'm attempting to point to. If we go back to the article, It's All Connected, So It All Matters, the fallacy of osteopathic possibilism. What is occurring historically in osteopathy is people have what I would call a movement finding. Something doesn't move. They also have the report of the patient, the symptom, right? So the sign is the thing that doesn't move. Either it doesn't move as expected in a gross fashion, so you try to take the arm up and it does it or it doesn't. Or it does it the same as one side and not the other, right? So look something like that. And for those only listening, one arm essentially goes all the way up, the other one doesn't go all the way up, right? So you have variance there. So it either moves the way it should, or the same as its pair, or it doesn't, right? So also you have yield to pressure of soft tissue, so you squish the tissues. Either everything squishes equally, or it doesn't. So you have these things going on. You have these tests in osteopathy. Based on where you find something, you dig into the anatomy book and you say, okay, this nerve's here, this nerve's here. I believe these lymphatic nodes or these lymphatic nodes or these lymphatic structures should be here, but they're highly variable in everybody. even though they do tend to regularly occur in certain areas. But it's like, okay, well, this person, it must be here because that's what the anatomy book says. You have ligaments. It's like, okay, well, this ligament must be here and it must be shaped this way and it must be about this size. So you take a normalized view of anatomy and you maybe underlay it. You find something superficial and you in the movement characteristic, and then you think about what's beneath it and you add that as an explanation, right? Just because something is in the area of the thorax and restricted doesn't mean it's impacting the lung negatively. It could be, but you'd have to do something. You'd have to have a before measurement of, say, tidal volume or reserve volume or expiration, right? So you'd have to have some test of lung function prior. You'd have to then apply treatment to remove that restriction, provably remove that restriction in motion. So first you have to have a way to honestly find that motion restriction, honestly change it, honestly report change. And then you have to rerun your lung volume test or your expiratory or your respiratory volume, tidal volume, whatever, whichever proper thing you need to test. And then you need to see a difference and you need to see it consistently. So in order to make a particular claim that this restriction always relates to this physiological change, you have to see it over and over and over and over again. One of the problems that you have is that human beings are not the same. And just because somebody has a restriction in one place doesn't mean their anatomy is the same or the same enough that it means the same thing as it did in another person. There's large amounts of variation, even though humans are all the same enough that we can be identified as humans. We're all different enough that we can be individually identified. And I've said this many times. So what I described is how you would build your claim and how you have to generate something across a lot of observations to be able to then make that claim and normalize it, right? So you have to understand that anatomy as reported is normalized based on the specimens that the particular investigators, whether it was the investigators that wrote the textbook or wrote the paper, whatever it is, it's a normalized reporting over multiple specimens. They will have to report the amount of specimens. They have to tell you these things. So just because it was found that way in most people doesn't mean it's found that way in the person you're working with. So the variability is a big thing. What this concept allows me to do is point now towards the concept of reductionism versus complexity. One of the complaints I've come across within osteopathy as a profession is that science can't appropriately Science can't appropriately measure osteopathy or appropriately observe osteopathy. What I will say to that is that over time, in the past, I have said that science as a methodology can measure osteopathy. People just don't like the results, right? So this relates reasonably well to the observation that I've had over time is that if you look at my osteopathic history project, you'll see that I note how knowledge was built epistemologically, ontologically. Essentially, you have an individual empirical observation, and then you have an explanation overlaid on it. So realistically, it's a dependent truth. It depends on the people that were being observed. It depends on the person interpreting the findings. So it's constructivism, or the truth is dependent on the individual observer, previous experience, and the environment of observation, parading as a positivist truth, or there is one truth, right? So it's done improperly. And the term anatomical possibilism does a decent job of explaining that category, that you see something in a particular area and you just think about the anatomy, and maybe underlay is a good way to say it. You underlay the anatomy with respect to what you found superficially. So the term reductionism essentially suggests that you're trying to control too many things, and this just isn't how it works. And that is an honest statement. So humans are complex enough that you can't possibly have the exact same outcome with every person based on a particular method. However, what you can do is you can use a particular method and you can apply a certain set of measurements and see how consistently they go in a particular direction or between particular parameters. You can see that. You can normalize that data so you can have a higher degree of confidence by reducing things to what can be observed and what can be done and seeing the general pattern. That doesn't necessarily in any way mean that that's how it will work for everybody, which is why you get this, or not this is why, this is likely why you get this tension between science, quote unquote, and osteopathy, quote unquote, because osteopathy is an applied profession, not necessarily a scientific discipline. It is not a discipline, right? It claims itself as a philosophy, and I don't even know that it's that. I have a hard time accepting it as a philosophy, or maybe it's a philosophy with very, very weak underpinnings, and it just kind of does what it wants to do instead of doing what it could do. So when they note in the abstract that in persisting with such an approach, so I'm reading, in persisting with such an approach to theory, practice, and reasoning, osteopathy may waste time, energy, intellectual capital, and as a result fail to take advantage of opportunities to develop more plausible, ethical, and person-focused approaches to patient care. Okay, so if you just keep thinking about what you found, what you identified, you are not in appropriate contact with what might be going on because you're not reducing appropriately. You're staying too complex and not constraining your thought or constraining your explanation appropriately. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean they're related causally. They may only be related in that they happen at the same time. There's a lot of factors. So the critique of reductionism in osteopathy does a reasonable job by accident noting that humans are complex. I would suggest culturally that this is the case, and it's an accident because osteopathy doesn't, as a whole, like the answers that science gives it about its claims. So there's this interesting thing with respect to how many pieces of sensory information you can take in versus how many you can meaningfully, consciously, cognitively handle. Now, I think there are challenges with the research that says this many sensory inputs at any given time frame and this many conscious bytes of data at any given time frame. I think there's challenges with that, but roughly, in a very rough sense, the amount of sensory information you can get versus the amount of things you can consciously process has a limit, and it's different. The amount of sensory pieces of information you can get could be very high, and your ability to consciously process them is much, much more restricted. Now, the actual numbers and how well that works can be debated. It can be discussed. I'm totally fine with that. But there is a difference between how much sensory information you can gain from sensory surfaces in the body and how much you can acknowledge and pay attention to. This is why the concept of cognitive load, or the cognitive load theory, does so much positive things, or so many positive things, for the ability to meaningfully practice osteopathy. Because yes, there's a lot of information. Yes, there's a lot of complexity, but you can't tap into it as a practitioner. You cannot. You cannot pay appropriate attention to all of that sensory information, and you cannot interpret it. The more you think about it, the less you're paying attention to what the heck you're finding. So my simple suggestion, based on the amount of thinking that does not appropriately describe reality in osteopathy that's been done over time, that leads these authors to give us this concept or this category of anatomical possibilism, would very easily be much better spent on exceptionally fundamental things. Reductionism would probably help osteopathy a lot because you can set up parameters and acknowledge that you're controlling some things, but you can't possibly control everything. So you want to generate the range of normal outcomes that you get from particular approaches or particular things. How much and how consistently does, say, cervical treatment alter heart rate, blood pressure? How consistently, how much does, say, something like compression of the fourth ventricle, CV4, what I call the volleyball bump, how consistently does that do anything to heart rate and blood pressure? Which way does it go? What's your average look like? What's your general range? Does it generally go in the direction you would hope that would maybe suggest something about increased parasympathetic activation or decreased sympathetic activation? You can't necessarily tell which one is which unless you have way more money and way more equipment. You don't have to do that. You have to get the fundamentals, the very, very base fundamentals, which is where reductionism would help. Reduce to, I'm going to check this thing, I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to measure these things. How often does this do this? Or how often does it go in this direction? Now you have a very, very nicely constrained, reduced box, that from that box and from your ability to identify that things happen consistently in a particular direction, now I can open the box a little bit and add another parameter because I have a good foundation there. So you build upon previously reduced knowledge so that you're making less assumptions that aren't observable. You want to minimize the amount of assumptions that you make. Most osteopathic explanations, especially with respect to what this article that I started with, or the abstract of it, the concept of anatomical possibilism, they're just not appropriate, right? There's assumptions that are being made that just because these things live in the same place, they cross paths, that they're appropriately connected, and when we observe them, they're not. Or we have observed them in the wrong way. We started with too many assumptions and then laid explanations on it, and then when we check those assumptions, our assumptions are incorrect. What I would say is go back to the very, very reduced place so that you have less assumptions. You have a stronger observable foundation of information. Then you add in another layer because you can trust that those things that are at the bedrock of your explanation are no longer assumptions. They're consistently observable within a range. But in actual applied practice, people are different. So you can start within this assumption. And then when it doesn't work, you have to explore outside of the assumption. That's really important. That ends up being why the heuristic-based approach that I suggest, because a heuristic in the definition that I use is a set of steps that generates possible solutions that you can test between. And this appropriately acknowledges the normal variation in humans and their presentations. It also acknowledges the requirement to restrict what I'm paying attention to, not think outside deeply or think in a way that can't be proven, right? Then appropriately responds to the situation at hand. I leave as much of my cognitive processing or my conscious cognitive processing available to paying attention to the person in the moment so that I appropriately respect the barrier concept. I don't make them say ouch. If I'm going direct, I will go through the motion that is restricted without making the tissue jump. I will add mild tension to it, but I really don't want to make it too tense. If I'm going indirect, if they say ouch, I'm making the soft tissue soft, I can appropriately pay attention to that, right? I'm sewing all of these things together so that there is some set of instructions for how you work through a particular clinical situation. So I'm trying to sew together what you would call the more abstract concepts that are omnipresent and consistently there, and the details will vary. The details will vary because the person is different. One person is different from another person. So you need that heuristic-based approach, or what I'm using terminologically as the heuristic-based approach, to properly pay attention to those people. That doesn't mean that from that approach, you can't set things up with parameters to generally see the range of results or direction and range of outcomes with osteopathic treatment. You can set this up properly. You just have to appropriately respect what's going on. You have to acknowledge that there is complexity, that you can't control it all, that you don't have the ability to make an explanation just because you found a restriction in one place and there's particular pieces of anatomy, and it obviously makes sense. You can't do that and be accurate or be honest. So osteopathy seems to have a superficial problem with what it calls reductionism. Says that people are too complex. Yeah, sure, there's something there. There's something to be acknowledged. There's something valuable there. But it's inappropriately acknowledging the value of reductionism. Reductionism is heavily helpful to set your foundation. From your foundation, you can then start to get towards that complexity. There are some things that aren't reproducible. Treatment 1 of person A and treatment 2 of person A are going to have some variation because there's variation, right? It's the same person, but it's a different time. So there are some things that won't be reproduced, but there are some ways to build a framework where you can get a consistent range of outcomes. Now, clinically, in an applied profession such as osteopathy that happens between two people in the physical realm, positivism and reductionism will help us understand properly what the heck might be going on, where our limits are, because we can get the foundation, we can then move layers out from the foundation into that complexity and start to acknowledge where maybe we don't have the methodological ability to really get solid reproducible answers, but we don't necessarily need solid reproducible answers. We may be better off with solid reproducible ranges of outcomes and understanding where the walls are and where the barriers are. So lots of concepts invoked. The concept within the abstract of this article, anatomical possibilism, the concept of ontology and epistemology within the philosophy of science, the concept of cognitive load theory, the concept of, or the barrier concept rather, the concept of attention available for conscious cognitive processing. These all sew together to explain, or maybe not explain, but appropriately relate to the approach that I'm advocating for within the profession. You manage cognitive load, you manage attention, you don't think too deeply about things because it's really easy for your explanation to be wrong. You're in the external environment of observation. So you acknowledge all of that. You acknowledge all of that complexity and you reduce because that's just how the human conscious experience seems to function. You actually have to reduce because you can't take it all in. So instead of thinking about all of the possible anatomical relationships when you're treating, pay attention to the person in that moment with as much sensory information as you can have and thus respond to them. You have a general framework in the barrier concept, which is fantastic if you understand how to apply it so that you can alter that person's restricted motion that you found appropriately without making them say ouch. You can stay true to that concept, but the barrier concept is a reductionist framework. It gives you very firm boundaries as to how to approach the person. So I think all in all, I'm hoping that that I'm advocating appropriately for properly acknowledging the benefit of reductionism and the benefit of complexity and how they play off of each other and how they will inform one another. So instead of saying that osteopathy can't be appropriately observed or measured by science, say yes, it can. It will be helpful. But yeah, it's complex. It's an applied field. Applied fields always have challenges in identifiable ways. So hopefully that gives you some understanding of how to piece between reductionism and complexity and all of these things, and to note how all of it will be helpful for osteopathy, but the place that osteopathy has done the least amount of appropriate work or high-level work is in that reductionist realm. Maybe we need to reduce things. Maybe, as I've said before, osteopathy is just bad at science, so it doesn't get science and then says negative things about science. So maybe it's time to reduce heavily, really start to understand things. Now, I will say that I am, instead of simply suggesting this, I am actively engaged in some of this work. I do have students. They are starting to produce thesis-based work or experiment-based thesis work. And we are seeing some things. They have reduced. They've made appropriate choices. They've made predictions. They've set up null hypotheses. This work is occurring, and over time we'll talk about it, and I'll make sure that I share it so that you get the example that I'm not just saying this. I am actively involved broadly in participating in doing this. So hopefully over time we'll talk about those results and you'll find it all interesting. Thank you for listening so far. Hope you found it useful, and we'll talk again soon.